Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to Philosophy. This is Professor Paul Hicks, and today we're going to talk about Plato. And in particular, we're going to talk about a very specific dialogue, the Meno. Now, Plato's Meno introduces us to aspects of Socratic ethics as well as the Platonic epistemology. It begins as a really abrupt challenge from the character Meno about whether virtue can be taught, and quickly becomes an open and inconclusive search for the essence of whatever this elusive virtue happens to be, or human goodness in general. The word that from ancient Greek is arete. Now, this translates to virtue, but it also translates to excellence, like an excellence in behavior. So keep that in mind, that there's not an exact translation into English for what they're actually trying to talk about and what they're actually understanding. The inquiry of the Meno exhibits very typical features of the Socratic method. That is, it's a refutation through cross-examination. It employs very typical criteria for the notoriously difficult goal of obtaining some sort of Socratic definition. And in addition to the dialogue's influence on ethics, what it does is that it lays the foundations for Plato's epistemology, for Plato's theory of knowledge. Plato is going to argue knowledge is not gained, but it is recollected. That is, knowledge is in us. It's what we're going to call innate in us. And this is going to lay the foundation for rationalism in the years to come in philosophy. So let's go ahead and get into the Meno and try to understand what Plato's trying to teach us here. So Meno asks Socrates if virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice, or if neither by teaching nor practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in what other way. Socrates responds by saying, "How can I know? I do not even know what virtue is." And he says further that he doesn't even know anybody who knows what virtue is. But of course, Meno responds and says that he and a friend of theirs, this guy named Gorgias, knew what virtue was, and that there was a conversation previously that Socrates should remember. Now, Socrates says that he has a bad memory and he can't remember, and so he asks Meno, "Please tell me what that conversation was actually about." So Socrates is really delighted that Meno is going to be able to tell him what virtue is. And Meno, of course, thinks this is going to be a very easy explanation. But if you've read any of Plato's dialogues, you know nothing's going to come easy as an explanation in these dialogues. So Meno lists out some virtues. He says there's a difference between the virtue, say, of a man and the virtue of a woman. So he lists out the virtue of a man, that they should be able to administer the state, and in the administration of it, they should benefit their friends and harm their enemies. As well as virtue is that he must not be careful not to suffer some sort of harm himself. When it comes to women, Plato argues that a woman's virtue, if you wish to know about that, may also be easily described. Her duty is to order the house, to keep what is indoors, and to obey her husband. That's what it means to be a virtuous woman, according to Plato. Obviously, there's some sexism in here, and you're going to find this throughout all of philosophy. But we can come back to that. So, for Meno, he argues that every age, every condition of life, young, old, male, female, bond or free, has a different virtue. Virtues, he says, are numberless, and no lack of definitions of them. Virtue is relative to the actions and the ages of each of us in all that we do. So Socrates comes back and says, "Wow, you're swarming me here with virtues," and he wants to say, "Let's go ahead and think of another type of swarm." And he gives the example of bees. So Socrates asks, "What is the nature of bees?" Now, saying that there are several types of bees does not really answer the question. What Socrates wants to know is, what is the essence of being a bee? Right? What is it that all bees actually have in common? What is it that makes bees bees? See, the same can be said for virtue. Saying that, as Meno did, that there's just a lot of virtues, there's many virtues out there, that doesn't actually help us to understand what virtue is. See, what Socrates is trying to understand is, what is the nature of virtue in and of itself? Not telling me what are different virtues. That's not going to help us at all. Right? So the same as from the bees, the same can be said of virtue. Right? So Socrates asks Meno, if there's one virtue of a man, another of a woman, another of a child, and so on, does this only apply to virtue? Or would you say the same of, say, health or size or strength? Is the nature of health always the same, whether in a man or a woman? Socrates and Meno both agree that health is the same whether it's in a man or in a woman. They give the example of being strong. So, for example, if a man can lift 100 pounds and a woman can lift 100 pounds, then their strength is really equal. It's the same. It's the same strength. It's the same thing. And the strength, therefore, is not different between the two. So virtue then is the same in a child, in an adult, in a man, and in a woman. And this shows that Meno was actually wrong, that virtue, when he said that virtue is different for different people. See, for if man's virtue is in ordering the state and a woman's virtue is in ordering the house, what is it that they both have in common? What is the virtues that those two things have actually in common? So if you were to order the state, and if you're to do it well, you would need to have temperance and justice, Socrates argues. Well, wouldn't that be the same for ordering a house? So the woman's virtue would be to have temperance and justice in ordering the house. So what we find here is that temperance and justice is what's needed no matter what the gender. Hence, no matter what the virtue serves, there's something common to all virtues. Now, Socrates believes he has shown the sameness of all virtues, and it has been proven here. And Socrates wants Meno to give him one definition for all of virtue. What is it that all virtues actually have in common? Define virtue in such a way that all virtues meet this definition, but only virtue meets this definition. How do I know what a virtue is if I was to come across it? So Meno gives another definition of virtue. He says it's the power of governing. Well, Socrates asks him to add on a little bit to that. He says, you do mean justly and not unjustly, don't you? Of course, Meno agrees because he says justice is a virtue. Now, Socrates needs to slow Meno down here just a little bit and needs him to clarify what his thoughts are on this. Does justice actually equal virtue? Like, as in justice is virtue? Or are we going to say that justice is a virtue? Right? There's a distinction here that needs to be made. We're not saying justice equals virtue, such that virtue and justice are the same thing. What we're saying is justice is a type of virtue. So Socrates gives an analogy of figures. If you were to have, say, is a square a type of figure, for example, or is a square equal to a figure? If you were to ask what is a figure, and I said, well, a square, you're not going to understand what it means to be a figure. You're just going to understand that a square is a type of figure, right? If you were to ask me if there's other figures, I would be able to tell you yes, and I'd be able to tell you what, in fact, they are. Socrates asks, is this the same about virtue? So Meno lists other virtues like courage and temperance and wisdom, but this keeps us really in the same problem. So listing out types of virtues does not tell us what is virtue. What is it that all virtues have in common? What is the essence of virtue itself? He gives another analogy of color. So for example, if I asked you what is color, and you responded, well, whiteness, that doesn't tell me what color is, because there's other colors. A particular color is not color in and of itself, and Socrates wants to know what color is, not the types of color. So Socrates then brings us right back to virtue. And he asks Meno, once again, what is virtue in the universal sense? Not what is virtue in the particular sense. Don't tell me what virtue is in a very specific situation. Tell me what virtue is so I'll know what virtue is if I was to come across it. Tell me what virtue has, that all virtue has, right? So I would know what actually virtue is. So Meno once again, needs to come up with the definition of virtue. And he says, well, virtue is the desire of things honorable and the power of attaining them. And they both agree that he who desires the honorable also desires the good. But then Socrates asks, if everybody desires the good, or do some people desire evil? And Meno comes back and says that some men actually desire evil. Now Socrates comes back to that and says, well, do you mean that they think the evil which they desire to be a good? Or do they know that they are evil and yet desire them anyways? Meno responds that a man knows evils to be evil and desires them notwithstanding. Right? Meno here believes that some people actually desire to possess evil. Right there, he goes, there's some who think that evils will do them good, where others who know that they will do them harm but desire them anyways. Now they agree that this is obvious that those who are ignorant of their nature do not desire them, but they desire what they suppose to be good, although they are really evils. And if they are mistaken and suppose the evils to be good, they really desire goods. So Meno argues that some people desire evil knowing it is evil, and knowing it will actually harm them. And so Socrates says, well, wait a second here. Does anybody really desire to be miserable and ill-fated? Of course, Meno replies, no, of course not. I admit nobody would desire that evil. But Meno then has to come around and defines virtue as the desire and power of obtaining a good. But Socrates responds that all people desire good. So the difference must be then in the ability of obtaining that good. Now this leads Socrates to force Meno to define virtue as the power of attaining good. What are the good a man seeks to attain? Meno answers, health, wealth, the possession of gold and silver, having a good office and honor in the state. So Socrates then asks, if virtue is obtaining gold, silver, and honor, does it actually matter on how it was obtained? Does it matter if it was obtained justly or unjustly? If I obtained gold and silver unjustly, was that virtuous? Was I virtuous if, say, I stole gold and silver? Right? If we're going to say what virtue is just obtaining gold and silver, then whether I do it justly or unjustly must be virtuous. Right? Well, of course, Meno says, well, no, I don't mean it like that. If you were to obtain these goods unjustly, that would not be a virtue. That would be what he calls a vice. Right? It's a vice. So Socrates asks, if non-acquisition of gold and silver in a dishonored manner for oneself or another, or in other words, the want of them, may be equally virtuous. And then Meno agrees. And so Socrates then concludes, the acquisition of such goods is no more virtue than the non-acquisition and want of them. But whatever is accompanied by justice or honesty is virtue, and whatever is devoid of justice is vice. Now Socrates gets Meno to agree that justice, temperance, and the like are all part of virtue. Okay, so we come up to a bit of a problem here, and it's what we have come to know as Meno's paradox. So let's try to get into this just a little bit. If you know what you're looking for, right? If you know what something is, would you inquire to understand what something is? That doesn't seem to make any sense, for if you know what something is, why would you inquire about it if you already know what it is? But if you don't know what you're looking for, Meno suggests that inquiry therefore is impossible, right? So, and the reason is this. For just think of, say, cats, right? So maybe you're from a place where you've never seen a cat, you don't know what a cat is, you've never heard of this term cat, and you want to know, what is a cat? Right? What is a cat? How would I know it was a cat if I actually came across it? All right? So if a person does not know what a cat is, then if a cat came across their path, they wouldn't not know it was a cat. They would know it's an object, they'd know it's something, but they wouldn't know that it is in fact a cat, because they don't know what cats are. They've never heard of cats. They don't know what a cat is. Right? They wouldn't know catness. if they saw it because they are completely unacquainted with cats. So Meno's paradox questions how knowledge is obtained and how we can know if something is right if we've never experienced it. We may ask our friends to show us how they interpret it, but they might actually be wrong and misleading. So if Socrates doesn't know what virtue is, how does he know if Meno gave him the right answer as to what virtue is? How do we know? Right? I mean, Socrates keeps going through here and saying, well, that's not virtue, and that's not virtue. That can't possibly be what virtue is. How does he know? Because by his own admission, Socrates says, I don't know what virtue is. And Meno is saying, how do you know that I'm being wrong? So, Meno states, but in what way will you look for it, Socrates? This thing that you don't know at all, what it is? What sort of thing among the things you don't know will you propose to look for? Or even if you should need right up against it, how will you know that this is the thing you didn't know? So, in order to get out of this, out of Meno's paradox, Plato actually argues that we don't learn in the way that you think we do. We're not taught things. In fact, we already know everything. We have forgotten it, but we know it. And what we are doing when we understand to know something is we are recollecting certain ideas of what to know. Prior to our birth, before we were instantiated into a human body in this form, our soul understood knowledge from past lives and for being within the realm of the forms, the realm of the ideas. And for Plato, you have simply forgotten these ideas, you have forgotten this knowledge, but through the right kind of questioning and through the critical thinking, we can uncover this knowledge. That is, this knowledge is already in us. This is important because this is going to lay the foundation for the theory of rationalism, that all ideas, that all knowledge is innate. That is, we don't need experience. We don't go out into the world looking for experience or searching for answers. All knowledge is already in our mind. We just have to uncover it somehow. We just need to recollect it. All we've done is forgotten it. All right, so all souls, he says, have already learned everything in many former lives, and learning in this life is therefore a matter of remembering what was once known but is now forgotten. So Socrates needs to prove this, and so what he does is Meno has a slave, and this slave has been raised in Meno's family's household since birth. He's never been educated. He knows absolutely nothing about mathematics or geometry or anything of this sort. And so what Socrates is going to try to do is he brings the slave boy over and he starts drawing in the sand. Right? He starts drawing squares and he starts saying, well, if this is true, can we know that something else is true? And here's what he discovers, that the slave is able to answer some very basic questions about geometry and about mathematics. Now, if this slave has never been educated, how does he know these things? How does the slave actually know geometrical principles if he's never learned geometry? See, Plato can answer this by saying, we knew this in a previous life. He knew this because his soul already knows everything, and he's just trying to uncover it, right? So for Socrates, the slave never learned these principles in this life, but yet the slave still has knowledge about geometrical principles, and so this suggests that he must have learned it previous to his birth, and he's merely recollecting what his soul has forgotten. So, what do we conclude here, and what do I really want you to know from the Meno, is the continuance of virtue, of course, and trying to understand what that is. But I think what's really important in the Meno is this theory of recollection, because this will lay the foundation for rationalism for many, many centuries to come, right? That all knowledge is innate in us. You already know everything. You just have to remember it. That's all you have to do, is try to remember it. All right, so that's going to leave the Meno. Please read it, get to understand it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me and we could talk it out. All right. I hope you enjoyed the Meno. I hope you enjoyed Plato. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.